Once again, we're with Dr. Kira Hefty to talk about the RAD framework. This time we'll be discussing implementation of the RAD model. So without further ado, Kira, if you want to jump right in.
So what I'd really like to do with you all is talk about this particular case study. This is in Everglades National Park, so kind of southern Florida, and there's a really important, very specific ecological community within the Everglades are these high elevation tree islands, and they're very culturally significant. They're ecologically significant within the larger Everglades system. And so here is where Everglades is located. Again, it's the southern tip of Florida, really unique ecosystem, also referred to as the River of Grass. And so it's generally this large flowing river. That's really what the Everglades is, or was historically, was one large flowing river, the widest river in the United States. Everglades became a national park in 1934, and it currently contains 1.3 million acres of designated wilderness. And so that's actually 86% of the land area of Everglades National Park. It is primarily this river of grass. And so if you're thinking of Everglades as kind of this serene, very flat, flowing freshwater body. And you see these kind of grass wetland meadows kind of throughout the Everglades. However, Everglades is still fairly diverse. So it is a lot of that. There's a lot of sawgrass, freshwater sawgrass fields within the Everglades, but it also contains these upland communities. And so it contains these kind of pockets of high ground. So here's this river of grass, and then you have these high islands within this river of grass that contain upland species such as slash pine, oak, palm, saw palmetto, which is a lower growing palm species, as well as some shrubs. There are also mangrove communities, but all of this exists kind of within this greater Everglades wetlands system. And so here's just kind of an aerial drawing of what these communities might look like. So you have these sawgrass, freshwater sawgrass ridges, and then you have these pockets of high elevation where you have these trees, and they're generally, when they're naturally formed, are this teardrop shape. And so if we're thinking of a river, the river is flowing this direction. And so we have this ridge here, this high elevation ridge. That's where you get your upland species, and the water moves around that, forming this teardrop shape of high elevation land. These islands have very important cultural significance, and Everglades in general has a lot of important cultural significance. And so there has been evidence of human habitation within the Everglades system, which seems like a system humans should not be able to live in, but they have for the last 10 to 20,000 years. Historically, these tribes were the Tequesta and the Calusa. However, they were decimated by warfare and disease by 1800 during the Seminole Wars by Europeans. And so these traditional historical cultural communities actually no longer exist within the Everglades system. However, other native communities moved into the Everglades after these communities were decimated, again during the Seminole Wars. Escaped African slaves, as well as other Native American communities that were previously extant farther north in Florida all the way to Tennessee, moved into the Everglades region and began to reoccupy the Everglades region. And it really became a sanctuary for Native American people, because this area is just so hard, so difficult to traverse, just given the nature of the terrain. And so it really became a safe haven that the Native Americans, primarily the Miccosukee tribe and the newly formed Seminole tribe, which included some escaped African slaves and other Native American communities, began to occupy this area. Just a little bit more about these tree islands. Again, they're kind of these pockets of high elevation. Florida in general is very low elevation, but kind of one of the cool things is that just a few inches of change in elevation can create an entirely new ecosystem within Florida. So because it's surrounded by fresh water, just a few inches higher in elevation, you get to upland area. And so if you're looking at this contour map on the right here, this is all in centimeters. So very different from a mountain landscape, but just going from 150 centimeters to 235, also you transition from being in sawgrass, wetland, swamp to at 235 meters being in a forest. So the hydro period, the length of freshwater inundation, and the depth of freshwater inundation is very important to forming these communities. These tree islands have really high plant and animal diversity. So for the Everglades in particular, if you're thinking about mammal species, other species that rely on upland habitat, they can't survive for long periods of time swimming in the water. These are points of refuge for wildlife, also sources or critical links for landscape connectivity. And so we've seen all sorts of interesting animals on these tree islands, including bear, Florida panther, bobcat have been sighted on these islands. And so it seems like an inhospitable landscape, but these tree islands make it hospitable for a variety of upland species, such as these mammals. Again, important areas of cultural sites for the Miccosukee tribe currently. They still participate in cultural activities on the islands. This is just an example of what their chikis, that's what these huts are called, that they have lived in, and also continue to revisit for important cultural practices. They're also highly visited recreation sites, and so you're going to the Everglades, some of the only high ground that you can hike around in the Everglades is on these tree islands, so they're very important for recreational use. And like I mentioned before, this freshwater inundation is absolutely critical for defining where these tree islands occur. And it's very sensitive to change in freshwater inundation. And so that has historically been an issue within southern Florida. There's been a lot of manipulation, direct human manipulation of freshwater flow within the greater Everglades system, including Everglades National Park. And so human European habitation really exploded in the 1920s. And they were selling off parcels of land like crazy, trying to sell this idea of paradise, which of course we know Florida is, I feel like, its own unique paradise. It's not what most humans think of as paradise, but it's this very interesting, very unique freshwater subtropical system. But when people moved there, they realized that, oh, the system floods and it could be lots of mosquitoes, and it's very wet for most of the year. And so what people began to do is build these extremely large systems of levees and canals and ditches to begin to funnel water away from residential areas, away from agricultural fields, and directly funnel it straight out to the ocean. So no longer allowing that water to traditionally flow through southern Florida as it previously had. So this is just an image of the watershed in Florida. Historically, this image on the left, we have the Kissimmee River, Lake Okeechobee, and all of the rainwater that would fall through Florida would flow south through Florida, through Lake Okeechobee, and then through the Everglades here at the tip of Florida. But what was accomplished within the early 1900s essentially is the impedance of that water flow through southern Florida, and instead using this system of levees, ditches, and canals, that flood water primarily coming from Lake Okeechobee was funneled straight out to the ocean on both sides of Lake Okeechobee and was largely cut off through the Everglades. So areas in the Everglades, some areas became really wet and some areas became really dry due to this human activity. And that has greatly reduced the number of tree islands within the system, as well as exacerbated some other effects of climate change. And so we have one of the other impacts in Everglades that continues to be a persistent threat is sea level rise. And so this image on the left here is current sea level at high tide. And so Everglades does include ocean habitat. And then all of this habitat within Everglades are those pockets of tree islands, as well as that sawgrass wetland area. But with sea level rise, this is 3 feet sea level rise in the middle here. And then in an extreme high emissions future, potential to reach 6 feet sea level rise in this image on the right here. And so we can see that this upland area is being encroached upon given varying projections of sea level rise. And so saltwater intrusion obviously is a direct impact to this landscape. Most of the plants in the Everglades are not adapted to a saltwater habitat other than mangrove, but the tree islands certainly are not adapted to a saltwater community. Also, another concern for these tree islands is increased prevalence of high intensity tropical storms and hurricanes and associated effects with those storms, such as storm surge. And so we're coupling that with sea level rise, and think that the storm surge is going to advance farther and farther inland with these associated with these storms. So this is an aerial image of a tree island in 2017 prior to Hurricane Irma, which occurred in September. And this is that same tree island just following Hurricane Irma. So this is all damage from the hurricane associated with storm surge, as well as very high winds. The eye of the hurricane came very close to this part of the Everglades. And so there are direct impacts from these storms. And then alterations of that natural sheetwater flow, that freshwater sheetwater flow has impacted the ability of these islands to recover following these storms. So the summary of the threats to these tree islands include that water diversion. So that's a direct impact to these tree islands. So some areas have become wetter, some areas have become drier. And in the areas that have become wetter due to this direct impact, we're seeing flooding, longer hydro periods on these tree islands, when some species on these tree islands can only handle inundation of fresh water for 10 to 20 days. So anything longer than that, the roots of these trees begin to die. And then we have loss of our forested communities on these previous upland systems, and loss of these tree islands as a whole. In the areas that have become drier, and so we have less freshwater inundation, that has actually allowed the advance of salt water onto the landscape. And so if you think about it as kind of a push and pull, and so if you have fresh water that's flowing naturally down the landscape, that's keeping that salt water, that seawater at bay. But in areas where it's become drier due to this diversion of freshwater flow, that's allowing saltwater intrusion to advance farther inland. And so that's already has been an issue, and then that is being exacerbated by sea level rise. And so that's as the sea level rises, you get more pressure from the ocean pushing farther inland into these areas. And then of course, those direct damages to the island associated with stronger storms, flooding associated with the storms, more intense precipitation and tropical storms, storm surge, et cetera, are all direct impacts from these acute intensifying hurricane events. Some threats to the resources on these islands. One, it's direct loss of habitat for wildlife. So lots of sensitive species within the Everglades system. One of those is actually the Florida panther. Will use these tree islands as habitat to traverse this landscape. And so we're losing our tree islands, we're losing those sources of connectivity for Florida panthers to traverse this landscape. And so it makes it more difficult, and animals actually following some of the more intense hurricanes that they've had in this region have actually gotten stranded on these islands because they've lost their points of connectivity to retreat back to mainland. And so losing these islands means losing connectivity and eventually losing your diverse suite of wildlife species that previously occurred within the Everglades. There's also a large threat to archaeological artifacts within the tree islands. And so some of these tree islands are naturally, ecologically natural. However, what archaeologists have discovered is that a lot of these tree islands actually, as they started digging into these tree islands, emerged because of Native American activities. And so these were areas where Native Americans were harvesting oysters, practicing making tools, and they are just finding mountains of artifacts underneath some of these tree islands, which has then created upland habitat, which then becomes a tree island. And so lots of important archaeological information within these tree islands, and very culturally significant, and as well as important sites of cultural activities. So the Miccosukee still use this area. The Miccosukee Reservation is just along the northern border of the Everglades, and they are still allowed to enter the Everglades to participate in ceremonial activities, rituals within the tree islands of these Everglades. So very culturally important to the Miccosukee. So this is a really nice video that kind of sums up some of what I just said, but really gives a good overview from the perspective of a member of the Miccosukee. So it's about a 4-minute video.
There are times that we can't use those islands for ceremony. So that impacts the culture of the Miccosukee. There are times that the deers don't have a place to seek refuge because the islands can be up to 3 feet underwater.
The small mammals and the larger mammals just can't survive for that length of time on inundated islands. Small mammals are such an important part of the ecosystem for transporting seeds into different areas. We are reintroducing some of the small animals back onto tree islands.
Certain species of plants on the tree islands cannot tolerate flooding for much more than 10 days a year. The tree islands are essentially drowning.
And the islands itself start dying. The tree roots start dying. And when the trees start dying on the island, the roots of those trees is what holds that islands together. So the islands will start shrinking.
Without tree roots to hold onto the soil, the islands erode and slowly disappear. Nearly 70% of the tree islands have disappeared since the 1940s. That's largely due to flooding because of how water flow has been managed.
We have tribal members today that remember living on tree islands and have seen the changes to this area. Even in my short lifetime, I've seen the changes. Our people were taught that in our time of need, the Everglades was here for us. So now that it's her time of need, we have to stand up and protect her, because someone has to speak for the voiceless. The Miccosukee people, we advocate for reconnecting the landscape. We need to heal the environment, because the way that it's being approached for Everglades restoration is still man trying to control nature. I say you need to get out of nature's way. And when it rains, let the water go where water wants to go, where water historically went. The Everglades is precious. It's the only one in existence on the world. If it disappears, we're not going to have another one. This place is yours. It doesn't just belong to Florida. The Everglades is a part of the world. So everyone has that right to have it protected so that their future generations can experience the Everglades.
All right. So with all of that information, again, those predominant threats to the Everglades being both climate change impacts, so sea level rise, as well as increasing intensity of hurricanes, but that's being exacerbated by the fact that this landscape has been heavily manipulated in the past. And so your jobs is to figure out what to do about this conundrum. And so you've actually been tasked to be a part of the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan. So this is a real thing. The CERP, it's an interagency and transboundary effort, which involves managers, scientists, rights holders, and other interest groups who collaborate to find solutions to the degrading ecosystem conditions within the greater Everglades system, particularly wilderness for this particular talk, and Everglades National Park. And so given these threats, the context of wilderness, how would you begin to address these challenges? And so you've been asked to contribute input that will hopefully guide management decisions for a short-term 10-year management strategy as part of the CERP. And so what I would like to do, let's see, we have about 9 people, so maybe we'll just do 3 breakout rooms and 3 people each. I have different categories of rights holders for this system, which are real people, which are real groups that are involved in making these decisions. What I would like to do was give you, put 3 people per group in a breakout room, so 3 total rooms, and you'll be assigned a role. And your job is to answer these key questions in relation to your task. And so identify the values and resources that you're most interested in protecting, discuss the trade-offs in choosing an RA or D strategy to fulfill your management goals or preserve your key resources or values. And then we'll come back as a big group and talk about the last 2, which is just kind of discussing what you landed on, if you choose an RA or D strategy, or maybe you choose multiple strategies, and what those strategies look like. All right, everybody, welcome back. I hope you had valuable discussions. We don't have very much time left, but maybe quick lightning round, starting with Mikasuki, just kind of give us your rundown over the next 30 seconds of what you think your strategy might have been.
So I think we were landing more in the like directing direction, where we were saying that, I mean, resisting might involve something as far as like divesting from oil and gas at the federal level, or extending park boundaries further north, which wouldn't be within tribes' jurisdiction aside from lobbying for those efforts. So in order to protect our cultural sites and tree islands and the wildlife that I'm sure were part of the culture and the lifestyle back then, we were thinking that the most acceptable policy might be direction, which could look something like, it's kind of a dystopian future, but like floating islands, floating boardwalks to preserve habitat connectivity, fortifying the tree islands in some way. Like, I don't know of an example of it, but something like a seawall that people use on coastal regions that at the same time wouldn't restrict wildlife from getting to the islands. So I don't know, this was a very difficult problem.
Yes.
That I don't envy anybody who has to work on, which is one of you, I'm sure.
Yeah, so it sounds like kind of a combination of resist and direct to try to retain cultural practice and important sites of cultural practices.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. All right, archaeologists.
Gabrielle, Laura, what did we do? What did we determine here? Right, we had some really concrete findings.
Oh, well, I mean, we said the most important was the archaeological resources. Obviously, we're archaeologists, so and I guess we kind of came up with a kind of sort of adaptive management strategy and identifying the specific resources that were the ones that were most important, because you can't save them all. And I don't know, try to fortify them, build levees, do channel liner, geotextile something. And then if that didn't work, then try to inventory and catalog and document the history the best you can.
So sort of a combination of resist and accept, it seems like, for you guys.
Did I miss
Be-
anything?
And be clear that the cultural history of the area makes up the wilderness character of the area.
Yes. All right, and then last but not least, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, which is the longest state agency name I've ever had the experience of working with. So what do you guys think?
I think we kind of just talked more about like resisting and accepting the change of the ecosystem to allow and create space for like by possibly doing like diversions of water and like reseeding, so the dry grasslands could like be restored in that aspect, and then divert the water away from or to, so it doesn't happen again.
It sounds like sort of a resist strategy then. So trying to keep things the same as they've been. Great. Well, we don't have really any time left, but thank you all for participating. I hope that was valuable for you to kind of just start to think about the framework. And I wanted to pick a scenario that you probably aren't familiar with, so you weren't biased, because we do tend to do that. But yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions, or yeah, want to talk more talk about rad stuff. I'm happy to do that.
Great. Thank you so much, Kira. This is super informative. Yeah, really fun framework and really helpful for us as working in land management, dealing with these issues into the future, because it's going to keep coming up.